The sound I remember most is the click of the deadbolt. It wasn't a loud noise. It wasn't a slam or a bang or a shout. It was a quiet, final little snick that sliced the night in two. Before the click, I was Joanna Avery, a daughter, a sister, a girl standing on the porch of her family home. After the click, I was just a problem that had been solved. The rain wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was a cold, angry November downpour, the kind that feels personal. It soaked through my thin jacket in seconds, plastering my hair to my scalp and blurring the warm yellow light of the porch lamp into a watery halo. Inside that halo, behind the rain-streaked glass of the front door, I could see my mother, Carol, turning away, her shoulders set in a line of perfect, resolute finality. My father, Robert, was a shadow behind her, his arms crossed. My sister, Claire, was nowhere to be seen. She never was when things got ugly. In my right hand, my fingers were clenched around a single $20 bill. It was already damp, the edges softening into pulp. My mother had pressed it into my palm just before she'd shut the door. Her fingers were cold, her nails perfectly manicured. "Be independent now, Joanna," she had said, her voice as crisp and emotionless as a bank statement. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, an eviction. My other hand was gripping the handle of a cheap suitcase, the one I'd used for a school trip in 10th grade. It contained everything they'd allowed me to take: 3 changes of clothes, my high school diploma, a toothbrush, and a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Everything else, my books, my photos, the life I'd known for 18 years, was on the other side of that door, in a world that no longer had a place for me. The reason for this eviction was simple, and it had a name: Claire. My beautiful, charming, younger sister had just been accepted into her dream university to study public relations, and the tuition was astronomical. A few hours earlier, I had sat at the dining room table clutching my own acceptance letter, a letter from Indiana State, complete with a partial scholarship for their business program. It wasn't glamorous, but it was my future. A future I had worked for, staying up late, studying until my eyes burned, earning the grades that got me in. My father had looked at my letter as if it were a piece of trash. "We can't pay for 2 tuitions," he'd said, his voice flat. It wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. Claire's opportunity is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. She's going to be someone. The unspoken part hung in the air, thick and suffocating. And you are not. Then just help me with what's left after the scholarship, I had pleaded, my voice trembling. I can work. I'll get a job on campus. I can pay for the rest of my college fund myself. That's when my mother had laughed, a short, sharp, humorless sound. "Joanna, there is no college fund for you. There never was." Every extra dollar we had went to Claire's future. The words hit me harder than a slap. I looked from my father's stony face to my mother's dismissive one. I looked for a flicker of doubt, a hint of regret. There was nothing, just the cold, hard certainty that they were right. I was the practical one, the responsible one. I was the one who could be sacrificed. Claire was the investment. I was just an expense to be cut. And now, standing in the rain, with the deadbolt clicked shut and a soggy $20 bill in my hand, I finally understood. The injustice of it all was a physical thing, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. They hadn't just chosen her over me, they had erased me. They had looked at my dreams, my hard work, and my future, and decided they were worth less than nothing. They were a liability. The porch light flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. The house was now just a silhouette against the stormy sky. My home. It wasn't my home anymore. It was just a building full of strangers who happened to share my blood. And as I turned and walked away from that silhouette, with the rain washing over my face and mixing with tears I refused to let them see, a single cold thought formed in the wreckage of my heart. I would be independent. Oh, I would be so much more independent than they could ever imagine. Thank you for being here with me. It means a lot to share this. Please let me know in the comments what city you're listening from today. I'd love to know where my story is reaching. You don't just get thrown out of your house at 18. It's not a sudden storm. It's the hurricane that's been brewing offshore for years, and you were just too close to see the waves building. Standing there on the curb that night, the past didn't just flash before my eyes. It flooded my senses, a tidal wave of memories that explained exactly how I'd ended up soaked and alone with $20 to my name. Our house in Bloomington always had two distinct smells: the sharp chemical lemon of my mother's cleaning supplies and the faint metallic scent of motor oil that clung to my father from his auto repair shop. It was a house of order and hard work, or so they claimed. But underneath the surface, there was a different kind of order, an unspoken hierarchy, and I was always at the bottom. My father, Robert Avery, was a man who believed sweat was the only true measure of a person's worth. He'd been a high school history teacher before quitting to open his garage, a decision he wore like a badge of honor. He saw the world in black and white. Things were either practical or frivolous. My love for books, my knack for organizing things, my quiet, analytical nature, he filed all of it under frivolous. Claire, on the other hand, was pure, dazzling light. Her laughter, her effortless popularity, her beauty, he saw these as assets, tangible proof of his success. My mother, Carol, managed the family's books with the same meticulous, dispassionate energy she applied to everything else. Her emotions were as neatly organized as her columns of credits and debits. Love wasn't a feeling, it was a resource to be allocated, and Claire always received the lion's share. She was their miracle child, born late in their marriage. I was just the first draft. I remember our family dinners. We had a heavy oak table that seated 6, but there were only ever 4 of us. My father sat at the head, my mother to his right, Claire next to her. I always had the folding chair, brought in from the hall closet. It's just easier to put away, my mother would say. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but after years, that folding chair started to feel like a metaphor for my entire existence in that house. I was the part of the family that was easy to put away. Birthdays were the starkest example of this emotional accounting. On Claire's 16th birthday, the driveway was adorned with a massive red ribbon tied around the hood of a secondhand Honda Civic. Her squeals of delight echoed through the neighborhood. For my 16th birthday, 2 years earlier, I'd received a $25 gift card to a bookstore. My father had clapped me on the shoulder, his hand heavy and awkward. "Here," he'd said, "go learn something useful." He didn't understand that stories and knowledge were useful to me, that they were my escape. To him, if it couldn't fix an engine or charm a customer, it was worthless. I tried to earn their approval in the only currency they seemed to value. I got a part-time job at a grocery store the moment I was old enough. I saved every penny. I'd offer my father money for the bills, and he'd take it with a grunt, never a thank you. I later learned from a misplaced bank statement that the money I gave him for the electricity bill often ended up as a deposit into Claire's account for her social development, clothes, concert tickets, trips with friends. I was the provider, the utility. She was the project, the investment. The final crack appeared the day my college acceptance letter arrived. I had found it in the mailbox, and my heart had hammered against my ribs with a fierce, joyful hope. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe this would be different. This was tangible, a scholarship, a business program. This was the useful thing my father always talked about. I was wrong. When I showed it to them, there was no celebration, just a heavy silence. Claire was in the living room, painting her nails a shade of glittery pink. She didn't even look up. "It's a good school, Dad," I said, my voice small. "It's not her school," he replied, his thumb jerking in Claire's direction. "Her future is set. We can't jeopardize that for this." This, my entire future, dismissed with a single word. My mother had simply nodded in agreement, already doing the math in her head, calculating the cost of my dreams, and finding them too high. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just the less favored child. In their eyes, I was a competitor for resources that rightfully belonged to their prized asset. My success was a threat to hers, and in the Avery family, there was only room for one winner. The first night of my independence was spent on a cold, hard bench at a bus stop. The rain had finally eased to a miserable drizzle, but the chill had sunk deep into my bones. Every time a bus rumbled past, its headlights would sweep across my face, and I'd flinch, turning my head away as if the driver could see my shame. I huddled inside my thin jacket, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself smaller, invisible. The city's sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, felt alien and menacing. The world I had known, the small, predictable universe of my home and school, had vanished. I was an astronaut whose tether had been cut, spinning untethered in a cold, indifferent void. By the third night, the cold had morphed into something more sinister. A shiver that started in my spine began to radiate outwards, an uncontrollable tremor that rattled my teeth. My throat was raw, and every breath felt like I was inhaling shards of glass. I was huddled in the covered entryway of a closed laundromat, the faint smell of bleach and old soap doing little to comfort me. I knew I was sick. A fever was building behind my eyes, making the streetlights pulse and swim. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, a gruff voice was cutting through the fog in my head. Hey, kid, you all right?" My eyes fluttered open. A man was kneeling in front of me. He was large, with a kind, weathered face and a thick gray beard. He wore a flannel shirt and a trucker hat. He looked worried. I tried to answer, to say I was fine, but all that came out was a dry, rasping cough that shook my whole body. He pressed the back of his hand to my forehead. "Whoa, you're burning up. We need to get you somewhere warm." His name was David Reed. He was a long-haul truck driver who had pulled over for a coffee and saw me slumped in the doorway. He didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. He didn't judge. He simply helped. He half-carried me to his truck, the engine rumbling a low, steady rhythm, and drove me to the nearest emergency room. The hospital was a blur of bright lights, beeping machines, and the sterile smell of antiseptic. They put a plastic bracelet on my wrist. I watched the nurse fill it out with a ballpoint pen. Name, Joanna Avery. Address, unknown. Seeing those two words, address, unknown, written in official black ink, broke something inside me that even my parents' cruelty hadn't managed to shatter. I had no address. I had no home. I was, officially, a nobody, a piece of human driftwood washed up on the shore of a city that didn't know or care that I existed. They diagnosed me with pneumonia. For 2 days, I drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, cocooned in the starched white sheets of a hospital bed. It was the first warmth and safety I'd felt in days, but it was a borrowed comfort, temporary and fragile. When I was discharged, a social worker gave me a pamphlet for a place called Haven House, a shelter for women. My worldly possessions had been reduced to my small suitcase and the hospital discharge papers. But as I was about to leave, a nurse stopped me. "The man who brought you in, Mr. Reed, he left this for you." She handed me a small, sealed envelope. Inside was another $20 bill, crisp and new, and a handwritten note on a piece of greasy napkin. It said, "You'll need this more than your father does." I never knew how he knew or what he'd guessed about my situation, but in that moment, that simple act of kindness from a complete stranger was the only thing holding me together. He had seen me when my own family had chosen to look away. I walked out of the hospital into the weak afternoon sun, the social worker's pamphlet in one hand and David's envelope in the other. I found a bench in a small, neglected park and sat down, my legs still feeling shaky. For a long time, I just sat there, watching the world go on around me. People walked their dogs, business people hurried past with briefcases, mothers pushed strollers. They all had a place to go, a purpose, an address. I opened my wallet. It was a cheap, worn thing I'd had since I was 14. I took out the original $20 bill my mother had given me. It was still creased and softened from the rain, stained with a faint watermark of my own misery. I laid it on the bench beside me. Then, I took out the crisp, clean $20 bill David had left. I placed it on the other side. There they were, $20 of exile and $20 of grace. One was a symbol of everything I had lost, a final, insulting severance package from my own family. The other was a symbol of unexpected kindness, a lifeline thrown by a stranger. And as I sat there staring at those two pieces of paper, something inside me shifted. The overwhelming grief, the self-pity, the desperate, childish wish for my parents to come and find me and say it was all a mistake, it all just evaporated. It was like a fever breaking. The emotional fog that had clouded my mind for days suddenly cleared, and in its place was a cold, hard, crystalline clarity. Crying wasn't going to get me a place to sleep. Being angry wasn't going to put food in my stomach. Hating them wasn't going to build me a future. They had made their choice. They had written me out of their story. Fine, I would write my own. This was the moment. The snap. It wasn't loud. It was a silent, internal realignment. The part of me that had always craved their approval, that had bent myself into pretzels trying to be the daughter they wanted, simply died on that park bench. The victim was gone. In her place, a strategist was born. I picked up David's $20 and carefully folded it, placing it in a secure inner pocket of my wallet. This was my foundation, my seed money, a reminder that goodness existed in the world, even if it wasn't where you expected to find it. Then I picked up my mother's 20. I didn't fold it. I looked at it, memorizing every crease, every stain. This was not money. This was evidence. It was Exhibit A in the case of Joanna Avery versus the world. It was a promise to myself. I would never be this powerless again. I would never again be in a position where my entire worth could be dismissed with a single crumpled bill. I put that bill in a different compartment, separate from the other one. It would not be spent. It would be kept. A reminder of the betrayal, yes, but more importantly, a reminder of the starting line. This was ground zero. With a deep breath, I stood up. My body ached, but my mind was sharp. I looked at the pamphlet for Haven House. It wasn't a handout. It was a resource. I looked at the city around me. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a landscape of opportunities. They had told me to be independent. They had no idea how seriously I was about to take their advice. My plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the objective was clear. Survive, stabilize, and then build. Build an empire so solid that no one could ever push me out into the rain again. Haven House was an old brick building on a quiet, tree-lined street, the kind of place you could walk by 100 times without noticing. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of floor polish and simmering soup, a scent of cleanliness and basic sustenance that felt more welcoming than any potpourri my mother ever used. The woman at the front desk had a stern face and kind eyes, Her name tag read Ruth Nolan, manager. She looked me up and down, taking in my hospital bracelet, which I hadn't had the heart to cut off yet, and my cheap suitcase. Her expression didn't soften, but it didn't hold any pity either, which I was grateful for. "You get one bed, one locker, and one chance to rebuild," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "We have rules. Curfew is at 10. You keep your space clean. You actively look for work. You contribute to chores. This isn't a hotel, it's a stepping stone. You use it or you'll lose it. Understood?" "Understood," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time in weeks. Ruth nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. The world doesn't owe you anything, but you owe it to yourself to try." Her words were like a splash of cold water. They weren't comforting, but they were real. And right then, real was what I needed. For the next month, Haven House was my entire world. I followed the rules to the letter. My corner of the small shared room was always immaculate. I scrubbed floors, folded laundry, and cleaned bathrooms without a single complaint. I was the first to volunteer for any task. I was building a reputation, brick by brick, starting with the only thing I had, my work ethic. During the day, I pounded the pavement looking for any job. Any job. I faced dozens of rejections. No experience, not hiring, come back next week. The $20 from David went towards printing resumes at the library and buying a cheap but clean blouse from a thrift store for interviews. My mother's $20 remained untouched in its pocket, a cold weight reminding me what I was working against. Finally, I saw a help-wanted sign in the window of a small, bustling diner called Alvarez's. It was a classic place, with red vinyl booths and a long Formica countertop. The woman behind the counter was wiping it down with a practiced, efficient motion. She had dark, tired eyes, but a strong set to her jaw. This was Elena Alvarez. "You ever wait tables?" she asked, her voice skeptical, after I told her I was applying. "No," I answered honestly, "but I learn fast. I'm organized, and I'm not afraid of hard work." She stared at me for a long moment, her gaze intense. I think she saw the desperation in my eyes, but she also saw the determination that lay beneath it. She saw a survivor, not a victim. "You start tomorrow, 6 a.m. Don't be late." I wasn't. That job became my sanctuary. The work was grueling. Long hours on my feet, demanding customers, the constant chaos of a busy kitchen. But I loved it. I loved the rhythm of it, the challenge of it. For the first time in my life, my ability to bring order to chaos was seen as a valuable skill. I didn't just take orders. I started to see the diner as a system. I memorized the regulars' names and their usual orders. I noticed the inefficiency in how the condiments were stocked and suggested a new layout that saved everyone time. I created a simple checklist for the closing shift to make sure nothing was missed. I kept a small notebook in my apron pocket, constantly jotting down observations, ideas, and patterns. It wasn't just about carrying plates. It was about understanding the mechanics of the entire operation. Elena noticed. One evening, after a particularly frantic dinner rush, she found me in the back reorganizing the dry storage pantry. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Joanna," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "You see the whole machine, not just your little part of it." It was the most meaningful praise I had ever received. It wasn't about being pretty or charming. It was about being smart, competent, useful. Standing there in the warm, food-scented air of the diner pantry, I felt the first solid brick of my new life click firmly into place. Life settled into a new, demanding rhythm. My days were a blur of early mornings at the diner and quiet evenings at Haven House. I saved every single dollar I could, my bank account growing slowly but steadily. It was the first money that was truly mine, earned by my own sweat and my own mind, and it felt more valuable than any inheritance. I was building my own safety net, one thread at a time. My notebook became my most prized possession. It was filled with diagrams of table layouts for maximum efficiency, notes on inventory management, and observations about customer flow during peak hours. At first, my coworkers thought I was strange, but when my systems started making their jobs easier and their tips bigger, their skepticism turned into respect. I wasn't just a waitress. I was the person who made the whole chaotic dance of the diner run more smoothly. It was during this time that I met Ben Carter. He wasn't a customer. He was a delivery driver for a local food supplier, a quiet man in his late 40s with a thoughtful expression and hands that were surprisingly clean for a man who hauled crates all day. He came in twice a week, always during the morning lull, and he was one of the few people who really saw what I was doing. One Tuesday, he watched me direct 2 new bussers during a surprise lunch rush, using hand signals and quiet instructions to prevent a complete meltdown. When the chaos subsided, he was leaning against the counter, a small smile on his face. "You've got a head for systems," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Logistics. Most people just see plates and people. You see a workflow." I flushed, surprised by the specific term. "I just like things to make sense," I said, wiping down the counter. "That's what logistics is," he replied. "Making things make sense. You ever think about doing it on a bigger scale than a diner?" The question lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. A bigger scale? I had been so focused on survival, on the day-to-day, that I hadn't dared to think beyond the walls of Alvarez's diner. Ben's question was a window opening onto a world I didn't know existed. We started talking more during his deliveries. He'd ask me about the systems I'd implemented, and I'd ask him about his job. He spoke about supply chains, freight forwarding, and inventory control with a surprising depth of knowledge. It turned out, Ben wasn't just a delivery driver. He had worked for 20 years as a senior logistics manager for a major corporation before getting laid off in a brutal corporate restructuring. He was driving a truck, he said, because it was simple and honest, and he was tired of corporate politics. He was tired of having his loyalty to a company run by a family be rewarded with a pink slip so the CEO's nephew could get a promotion. His story resonated with me on a profound level. He, too, had been deemed expendable by a family that put bloodlines before competence. He saw a kindred spirit in me. "The world runs on chaos," Elena had told me one day, watching me sketch out a new schedule on a napkin. "People like you keep it moving." Between Elena's encouragement and Ben's insights, a new ambition began to take shape. My skills were bigger than this diner. My mind could handle more complex systems. Ben saw it, and he started bringing me articles clipped from trade magazines, highlighting job postings for administrative assistants and dispatch coordinators at local shipping companies. One day, he handed me a neatly folded printout. "Everline Freight," he said. "They're a mess, but they're growing. They need someone who can organize a hurricane. Sounds like you." I looked at the job description. It asked for a college degree and 2 years of experience. I had neither. All I had was a high school diploma, a notebook full of diner diagrams, and a burning, desperate need to prove my own worth. I almost threw it away. But then I looked at Ben, and he just nodded, a look of calm confidence on his face. He believed I could do it, and for the first time, I started to believe it too. Walking into the offices of Everline Freight felt like stepping onto a different planet. The air smelled of stale coffee and photocopier toner, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of sizzling bacon at the diner. The interview was with a man named Tom Whitaker, the regional manager. He was a harried-looking man with a kind but tired face, his desk buried under precarious stacks of paper. He looked at my resume, which was painfully thin. "It says here your only experience is at a diner," he said, raising an eyebrow. I took a breath. This was it. "Yes," I said. But in 6 months at that diner, I redesigned their inventory system, cut their food waste by 15%, and created a new staffing schedule that reduced overtime costs by half. I don't have a degree, Mr. Whitaker, but I know how to make broken systems work. I opened my bag and pulled out my notebook. I showed him the diagrams, the checklists, the data I had meticulously collected. I didn't talk about waiting tables. I talked about workflow optimization and resource management. A slow smile spread across Tom's face. He leaned back in his chair. "You've got no degree, but you've got instinct. We can work with that." I got the job. It was an entry-level clerical position, mostly filing and data entry, but to me, it was the keys to the kingdom. I absorbed everything. I learned about shipping routes, billing codes, and fleet management. And just as I had at the diner, I started seeing the patterns, the inefficiencies, the places where the system was breaking down. My biggest obstacle wasn't the work. It was a coworker named Mark. He was a classic office politician, slick and lazy, with a knack for taking credit for other people's work. He saw me, a young woman with no degree, as an easy target. He'd dismiss my suggestions in meetings, then rephrase them as his own a week later. He'd accidentally delete my files or forget to pass on important messages. The old Joanna would have shrunk under that kind of pressure. She would have tried to appease him, to make herself smaller, but the old Joanna was gone. I remembered the cold finality of the deadbolt. I remembered the words, "address unknown." I wasn't going to be made invisible again. So I started collecting receipts. Not just paper receipts, but a different kind. Every suggestion I made, I first sent it to Tom in a dated email, creating a digital paper trail. Every time Mark gave me a verbal instruction I knew he'd later deny, I'd follow up with an email. "Hi, Mark, just confirming your request to..." I documented everything. My work, his sabotage, the results of my improvements. It was all there in a private folder on my computer, organized and timestamped. The breaking point came 6 months in. I had designed a new dispatching system that would save the company thousands of dollars in fuel costs. I presented it to my team. Mark scoffed at it. 2 weeks later, during a major regional meeting with executives from corporate, Mark stood up and presented my system as his own, using a PowerPoint he had clearly cobbled together from my notes. He finished his presentation to a round of applause. I watched him, my heart hammering, not with fear, but with a cold, calculated fury. He sat down, a smug smile on his face. Tom Whitaker, who was running the meeting, turned to the room. "An excellent proposal, Mark. Truly." He paused. "It's so good, in fact, that it's almost identical to the detailed 15-page plan Joanna Avery emailed me 3 weeks ago." He projected my original email onto the giant screen at the front of the room. The date was clearly visible. The entire room went silent. Mark's face went from smug to sheet white in a single, beautiful second. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, watching him implode. My receipts had done the talking for me. That day, I learned a lesson more valuable than any college degree. Competence is your weapon, but documentation is your armor. After the incident with Mark, everything changed at Everline Freight. He was quietly moved to a dead-end department, and I was given my first real promotion. Tom Whitaker became my mentor, giving me more responsibility, bigger projects, and tougher challenges. I devoured them all. Within 2 years, I wasn't just a clerk. I was the company's go-to problem solver, the one they called when a supply chain was in knots or a workflow was bleeding money. I was earning a decent salary, enough to move out of Haven House and into my own small, clean apartment. It was the first space that was truly mine, and the feeling of turning my own key in my own lock was a victory I savored every single day. But I was restless. I was grateful to Tom and Everline, but I saw a bigger picture. The problems I was solving weren't unique to them. Countless small and mid-sized businesses were struggling with the same logistical chaos, but they couldn't afford to hire a full-time operations expert. There was a gap in the market, a need I knew how to fill. Ben Carter and I had stayed in touch. We met for coffee once a month, and I'd tell him about my work. He was my sounding board, my unofficial advisor. One Saturday, sitting in a quiet cafe, I laid out my idea for him. A consulting firm, a company that would act as an on-demand operations department for businesses that needed to streamline their processes but lacked the expertise. "We'll call it Emerge Operations Group," I said, the name coming to me in a flash of inspiration. Because that's what we'll do. We'll help businesses emerge from the chaos, stronger and more efficient. Ben looked at me, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. "When do we start?" he asked. At 23 years old, I quit my stable job, cashed out my meager savings, and became a founder and CEO. Ben came on as my first partner. We started small, working out of my tiny apartment. Our first clients were businesses Ben knew from his delivery days. I would go in, analyze their operations, and deliver a comprehensive plan for improvement. My reputation grew through word of mouth. My plans worked. I saved companies money. I made them more profitable. The business exploded. Within a year, we had a proper office and a small team. By the second year, we were hiring consultants. My past life of poverty felt like a dream. I was now dealing with CEOs and business owners, people who respected my mind and valued my advice. On my desk, I kept two things in a small, elegant shadow box. On one side was the hospital bracelet with the words, "Address unknown." On the other was the crumpled, rain-stained $20 bill my mother had given me. They were my daily reminders of where I had started and why I could never, ever stop. As Emerge grew, so did its profits. I lived modestly, but I invested the company's money with a fierce strategic focus. I wasn't just building a company, I was building a fortress. I started quietly acquiring smaller businesses, including a small, unassuming investment firm that specialized in providing high-interest, last-resort loans to struggling family-owned businesses. It was a niche market, one that most big banks ignored. To me, it felt poetic. I now owned a company that held the fate of other families in its hands. I told myself it was just a smart business decision, a diversification of assets. But deep down, a colder, more patient part of me knew I was acquiring a weapon. I didn't know when or how I would use it. I just knew that it was better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. One day, a major contract with a national retail corporation, a deal brought in by a CEO named Mr. Henderson, who was incredibly impressed with my work, officially put Emerge on the map. We were no longer a small local firm. We were a force to be reckoned with. And I, Joanna Avery, the girl who was worth nothing, was the one in charge of it all. 5 years. 5 years to the month since I had walked away from that dark house in the rain. In 5 years, I had gone from homeless to the head of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm. My life was a world away from Bloomington, Indiana. I had a new city, new friends, and a future I had built with my own 2 hands. I rarely thought about my family. It was like a chapter from a book about someone else's sad life. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. It was a weekly summary report from the investment firm I owned, the one that handled the high-risk business loans. I usually just skimmed these reports, but one name jumped off the page, and my blood ran cold. Applicant, Avery and Son Auto Repair. Loan request, $150,000 emergency bailout. Status, pending final review. Avery and Son. The irony was almost laughable. My father, who had never wanted a son, had named his business for an heir he never had, completely erasing the daughter who had stood right in front of him. I clicked open the file. The numbers told a story of years of mismanagement and stubborn refusal to adapt. They were on the brink of foreclosure. They were about to lose everything. The business, the house which was leveraged against it, their entire world was collapsing. And their application had landed on my desk. Not literally, of course, but it was my company, my money, and my final decision. The loan officer had flagged it as extremely high risk, recommending an immediate denial. But the final call on loans over a certain amount had to be escalated. The final call was mine. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt like I was standing on that porch again, the cold rain soaking through my jacket. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by an icy calm. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a reckoning. My assistant, Sarah, a sharp, incredibly loyal woman who knew only the successful, confident version of me, buzzed me on the intercom. "Joanna, your aunt is on line 2. Susan Miller?" Susan, my mother's younger sister, the one who always sent cloyingly sweet Christmas cards, but never once called after I'd been kicked out. A cold suspicion bloomed in my chest. I picked up the phone. "Joanna, darling, it's been too long." Her voice was syrupy sweet. "I heard about your incredible success. Your mother is just so proud." Lies. All of it. I cut straight to the point. "Why are you calling, Susan?" Her voice faltered for a second. "Well, I know things were difficult, but your parents, they're in a bit of a tight spot. Robert's business, it's not doing well. I happened to hear about this wonderful investment firm that helps old family businesses, and I passed the name along to them. I just thought, family helps family." And there it was. She hadn't known the firm was mine. She was just a pot stirrer, a manipulator, likely hoping to get back in my good graces, and maybe get a cut by connecting her desperate family with a potential savior. She had inadvertently led them straight into my web. "Thank you for the information, Susan," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I have to go." I hung up before she could reply. I stared at the loan application on my screen. I could deny it with a single click. End it, right here, right now. Let them face the consequences of their own choices. It was what they deserved. But that felt too easy, too quiet. After 5 years of silence, I realized I didn't want them to just disappear. I wanted them to know. I wanted them to look me in the eye when their world came crashing down. I called Sarah. "Clear my schedule for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. and book the main boardroom. I'll be meeting with the applicants for the Avery loan myself." "You're meeting them in person?" she asked, surprised. "You never do that." "This time is different," I said. "Oh, and Sarah, tell them the final decision will be made by the president of the fund. And make sure my personal lawyer, Mr. Harrison, is present." The week leading up to the meeting was the longest of my life. I worked on autopilot, my mind a whirlwind of past hurts and future possibilities. I spent hours at night, not sleeping, but preparing. I pulled up every piece of documentation I had. The digital copy of the email from my father refusing to even discuss my college financial aid. The old bank statements I had saved, showing the money I gave them for bills being transferred directly to Claire's account. I even found a data recovery service that, for a steep price, managed to pull a corrupted audio file off an old phone. It was a recording of my final, desperate phone call to my mother from the bus station, the one where I begged her to reconsider. I hadn't listened to it in 5 years. The day of the meeting arrived, gray and overcast, a perfect reflection of my mood. I stood in my corner office, which overlooked the entire city, and watched a small, beat-up pickup truck pull into the visitor parking lot. My father's truck. 3 figures got out. My father, looking older and stooped. My mother, her face tight with anxiety, but still trying to project an air of superiority, and my sister, Claire, looking impossibly young and out of her depth in a cheap, ill-fitting business suit. I watched them on the security feed as they entered the gleaming lobby of my building. My father looked around with a mixture of awe and resentment. My mother wrinkled her nose, as if the air in my successful world was somehow offensive to her. They treated Sarah, my assistant, with a dismissive condescension when she greeted them, as if she were a servant. "The president will be with you shortly," Sarah told them, leading them into the main boardroom. "Can I get you some coffee or water?" "We'll speak directly with the person in charge," my father grunted, sitting heavily at the head of the enormous mahogany table, as if trying to claim a throne that wasn't his. I watched them on the monitor in my office, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. They hadn't changed. They were still the same arrogant, entitled people who had thrown their own daughter out into the street. They walked into my world, the world I had built from nothing, and believed they had the right to make demands. They believed they were owed something. The sheer, unmitigated hubris of it was breathtaking. My father said something to my mother, his voice too low for the security mic to pick up, but he gestured around the room. I could read his lips. "Must be nice," he sneered. Then he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Don't worry," he said, his voice now audible. "These investment types, they understand the value of a legacy, a family business. They'll approve the loan. People like us built this country." The profound, stomach-turning irony of that statement almost made me laugh out loud. People like us. He had no idea who he was talking to. He had no idea whose house he was in. He was a fly, walking confidently into the center of a spider's web, admiring the architecture. The wait was over. It was time. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I straightened my jacket, nodded to Mr. Harrison, my lawyer, and walked down the hall to the boardroom. It was time to meet the president. The walk down the carpeted hallway to the boardroom felt both impossibly long and incredibly short. The rhythmic click of my heels on the polished floor was the only sound, a countdown to a moment 5 years in the making. Mr. Harrison, a calm and stoic man in his 60s, walked beside me, his presence a silent pillar of support. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, the three of them were sitting at the far end of the long table, looking small and insignificant in the cavernous room. They didn't look up immediately, assuming I was an assistant or a secretary. My father was frowning at some papers. My mother was inspecting her nails, and Claire was fidgeting with her phone. I walked to the head of the table, opposite my father, and placed my leather portfolio down with a soft but decisive thud. The sound made them all look up. And then, silence. A thick, complete silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I watched their faces, and it was like watching a film in slow motion, a series of expressions shifting and collapsing in on themselves. First, confusion, a flicker of recognition, but their minds couldn't place me in this context. This was the world of power and money. I didn't belong here. Then, the dawning, horrified realization. My father's jaw went slack. The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her makeup standing out in stark, painted relief. Claire's eyes widened, and her phone clattered from her fingers onto the tabletop. It was my mother who spoke first, her voice a strangled whisper. "Joanna?" My father found his voice next, a bewildered, angry growl. What are you doing here? Are you the secretary?" I let the insulting question hang in the air for a moment, savoring the sheer ignorance of it. I looked from his face, to my mother's, to my sister's. I saw no remorse in their eyes, just shock and a dawning sense of dread. They weren't seeing their long-lost daughter. they were seeing a complication, a problem. I gave them a small, cold smile. It didn't reach my eyes. "Hello, Robert, Carol, Claire." I used their first names, severing any last lingering thread of familial connection. I'm not the secretary. I gestured to the plush leather chair at the head of the table. My chair. I owned this place. The statement landed in the center of the table like a grenade. My father recoiled as if he'd been physically struck. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a gesture of shock that was 5 years too late. You own this company?" my father stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. The investment fund?" "I do," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "Which means the application for a $150,000 bailout loan for a failing auto repair shop is sitting on my desk." I let the full weight of that sink in. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely, seismically inverted. For 18 years, they held all the power of shelter, of food, of love, of my future. They had used that power to cast me out. Now I held all the power. I held their business, their home, their entire mismanaged legacy in the palm of my hand. The girl they had decided was worthless was now the only person in the world who could decide theirs. Claire started to cry, soft, gulping sobs of disbelief. My father just stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a hook. But it was my mother's reaction that I would never forget. Her face hardened, the shock replaced by a flicker of the old, cold calculation. I could see the gears turning in her head. She wasn't thinking about what they had done to me. She was trying to figure out how to use this, how to turn my success into her salvation. The monster was cornered, and it was getting ready to bargain. The silence stretched, broken only by Claire's pathetic whimpering. It was my mother who finally broke it, her voice taking on a tone of syrupy, false warmth that turned my stomach. "Joanna, honey," she began, starting to rise from her chair as if to come and hug me. We had no idea. We are so proud of you. This is wonderful. Of course, this changes everything. You can help us. We're family after all." I held up a single hand, and she froze in place. "Sit down, Carol," I said, my voice sharp. Mr. Harrison discreetly placed a small audio recorder on the table. "This is not a family reunion. This is a business meeting, and as the president of this fund, I have to tell you, your application is deeply concerning." I gestured to the large screen on the wall behind me. With a click of a button on my laptop, the screen came to life. The first document I projected was a copy of an email. "Let's start with fiscal responsibility," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "This is an email from Robert Avery, dated 5 years ago, in response to my request for help with my college tuition. It reads, and I quote, 'We have no money to spare. You are 18. It is time for you to be independent. A clear statement of your financial priorities.'" My father flinched as his own words were displayed for the room to see. "However," I continued, clicking to the next slide, "bank statements from that same month show 2 transfers totaling $3,000 from your business account to a personal account belonging to Claire Avery. The memo line on both reads, 'University shopping trip.'" Claire stopped crying and looked up, her face pale with guilt. "So it wasn't that you had no money to spare," I said, looking directly at my father. "It's that you had no money to spare for me. This demonstrates a long-term pattern of poor and emotionally driven financial decisions. That's a major red flag for any lender." This This is a personal matter, my father blustered, his voice rising. It has nothing to do with the business. On the contrary, I said smoothly, clicking to the next slide, which showed their business's declining revenue over the past 5 years. It has everything to do with the business. It shows you prioritize sentiment over sound investment. You funneled money out of a struggling business to fund a lifestyle instead of reinvesting in equipment, training, or marketing, which brings me to the core reason your business is failing. My mother started to speak again, her voice pleading. Joanna, we made mistakes. We know that. We miss you. We regret everything. Please, don't do this out of revenge. Revenge. The word was so small, so inadequate for what I was feeling. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. This was about balancing the books. This isn't about revenge, Carol, I said. This is about risk assessment. And before we conclude, there's one more piece of data I'd like to review. I paused, letting the tension build. Then I clicked the play button on an audio file. My own voice, thin and desperate, filled the room. The voice of an 18-year-old girl crying at a bus station. Mom, please, just let me come home for a few days. I'm sick. I have nowhere to go. Then my mother's voice, cold and clear as a winter morning. You made your choice, Joanna. We have to focus on Claire's future now. She deserves everything. You need to learn that you deserve nothing. Be independent. The audio file ended. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of 3 lives being irrevocably shattered by their own words. My mother looked like she had turned to stone. The last desperate hope in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by the hollow emptiness of total defeat. They had been exposed, not by my anger, but by their own cruelty, preserved and played back for them in crystal clear high fidelity. My receipts were undeniable. Thank you for staying with me through this. You are a truly wonderful and patient person. Please, if you're still here, press the like button and comment with the number 1 below, just so I know you've journeyed this far with me. Your support is a bigger encouragement than you could ever know. Just type the number 1 and let me tell you how it all ended. The recording of my mother's voice hung in the air like poison. No one moved. No one spoke. The final, brutal truth of who they were had been laid bare on the polished mahogany table, and there was nothing left for them to hide behind. The masks of concerned parents and deserving business owners had been ripped away, leaving only the ugly, selfish reality beneath. I let the silence sit for a long, heavy minute. I wanted them to feel the full weight of it. I wanted them to understand that this was a hole they could not talk, lie, or manipulate their way out of. Finally, I spoke, my voice low and steady. It was the voice of a CEO making a final, non-negotiable decision. The purpose of this fund, I said, folding my hands on the table in front of me, is to invest in businesses that have a viable path to future success. We look for responsible leadership, sound financial planning, and a history of making smart investments. I looked at my father. You have demonstrated none of those things. I looked at my mother. Your management of the company's finances has been negligent. I looked at Claire, who was now staring at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. And your entire future was financed by draining the resources of a family that could not afford it. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes locking with my father's one last time. You see, an investment is a lot like raising a family. You have to nurture all your assets. You can't pour all your water, all your sunlight, all your resources onto one perfect flower and expect the whole garden to thrive while leaving the other one to wither in the dirt. Eventually, the rot from the neglected part spreads, and the whole thing dies. I picked up the loan application from the table. It felt impossibly heavy in my hands, a summary of all their failures. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, I ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper was loud and violent in the quiet room. Then I ripped it again, and again, until it was nothing but a pile of scraps in front of me. "Your loan application," I stated, my voice leaving no room for argument, "is denied." My father slumped in his chair, a broken man. All the bluster and anger had drained out of him, leaving behind a frail, defeated old man. Claire was openly sobbing now, the ugly, gulping cries of someone who was finally, for the first time in her life, facing a real consequence. My mother just stared at me, her eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. It wasn't hatred, it was something worse. It was the look of someone who finally realized they had discarded a winning lottery ticket only to watch it be claimed by someone else. She had bet on the wrong daughter, and she had lost everything. "You once told me to be independent," I said, standing up. My voice was no longer angry. It was just tired, free. Today, I have made a decision based on the principles of responsible, independent business management. The same principles you taught me to value so highly on that rainy night 5 years ago. I turned to my lawyer. "Mr. Harrison will show you out." I didn't look back as I walked out of the boardroom. I didn't need to. I could feel the cold weight of their ruin behind me. It was not a feeling of triumph. It was a feeling of closure. The books were finally balanced. The debt had been paid, not by me, but by them. My father, stripped of his business and his pride, had apparently suffered a minor heart attack. And Claire, whose perfect future had been built on a foundation of sand, was working 2 jobs, one at a coffee shop and one as a retail clerk, to help make ends meet. I felt nothing. No joy, no pity, no satisfaction. It was like reading a news story about strangers in a distant country. Their lives, their struggles, were no longer connected to mine. The emotional tether had been severed in that boardroom, and I was finally, truly free. My life was full. My work was challenging, my friendships were real, and my future was secure. Their chaos could no longer touch me. About a month after the meeting, on a crisp, clear Saturday, I found myself driving the long highway back to Bloomington. I didn't know why exactly. It was an impulse, a pull towards the place where my story had both ended and begun. I didn't drive to my old house. I didn't drive to the garage. I parked my car a few blocks away and walked to the bus stop where I had spent my first night of homelessness. It looked exactly the same faded green bench, the same plastic shelter with a crack in the corner. I sat down on the bench, the sun warm on my face. This place, which had once been the site of my deepest despair, now felt peaceful. It was no longer a monument to my pain. It was a monument to my survival. I thought about the 2 $20 bills. The one from my mother, a symbol of rejection, still sat in its shadow box on my desk. The one from David Reed, a symbol of hope, had been the first deposit into the bank account that started my empire. One had tried to end me, the other had helped me begin. I sat there for a long time, watching the world go by. I was no longer the scared, sick girl shivering in the rain. I was a woman who had built her own home, her own family, her own future. They had thrown me out with nothing, but in doing so, they had given me the one thing I truly needed, the chance to become myself. Before I left, I walked to a nearby flower stand and bought a small, bright bouquet of sunflowers. I walked back to the bus stop and placed them on the bench. It wasn't a memorial. It was a thank you, a tribute to the rock bottom that had forced me to find a strength I never knew I possessed. As I walked back to my car, my new life waiting for me, I whispered the words to the empty air, a final closing of the chapter. Because everyone deserves a future, especially the ones who were told they didn't. Thank you so much for listening to my entire story. I am truly grateful for your time and your presence here. If you've made it all the way to the end, please comment with the letter A below, so I know you're one of the special ones who saw it through. If you have any thoughts or feelings you'd like to share, I would be honored to read them. Please click on another video on this channel to continue enjoying the stories we have to share. Thank you again.